Good day, everyone. You are watching Voice of the Voiceless with Dan Kovalik. I have the honor and pleasure today of being in conversation with my good friend John Perry. He's in Masaya, Nicaragua. He's been there for some time, and I want to welcome him to our show. Welcome, John. Good to have you.
Hi, Dan. Good to be with you.
Thank you. I guess the one thing that's on everyone's mind right now is COVID-19, so we'll just jump right in. How has the COVID pandemic been in Nicaragua, and how has the government been handling it?
Well, as you probably know, Nicaragua had a lot of criticism about its approach to the pandemic back in March, April last year. Mainly because the government decided that it wasn't going to close down the economy. In Honduras and in El Salvador, there were very severe lockdowns, and it caused a lot of economic hardship. So Daniel Ortega decided that the economy here wouldn't be shut down, that people would be advised to wear face masks and take all the usual precautions. There were extra precautions being taken at the borders since January last year, much earlier than many other countries, so that people were told to go into quarantine for 14 or 21 days. And we did have a peak of virus cases and deaths in April, May, June, July. But then and several notable people, including the mayor of Masaya, sadly died in that period. But most of the deaths were amongst older people and people who got other complications, other illnesses. And then the pandemic just subsided, really. From about July onwards, there were fewer and fewer cases. There are still cases now, a handful, but I haven't heard of anybody having the illness now for several months, and life has largely returned to normal. People are wearing face masks in the centre of town. There are precautions when you go into shops and offices, especially government buildings. But really, it's been an untold success story here. 19 hospitals were equipped to deal with COVID patients. They were never overwhelmed. They were at peak capacity in a few cases at one stage, but now many of those units have now been converted back to normal use. And the health service, which, as you know, is free in Nicaragua, never had to turn away other patients. It was always able to deal with other illnesses apart from COVID. So, I think it's been a remarkably successful approach. And in contrast, Honduras, for example, has got rampant COVID cases at the moment, over 170,000 cases officially, whereas Nicaragua is only around 5,000 or 6,000 in total. And many doctors and nurses in Honduras have died, very sadly. So Nicaragua is really standing out as an example of how to deal with COVID in a poorer country.
It's interesting, that contrast that you point out between Nicaragua and the other Central American countries. I was listening to NPR last week, and they were talking about the surge of migrants to the U.S. that we're experiencing right now from Central America. And they said from Honduras and El Salvador and Guatemala. And I noticed they did not mention Nicaragua. They did not mention migrants coming from Nicaragua. Why do you think that is? What makes Nicaragua stand out from those other Central American countries?
Well, there are several different factors. I think one of the main ones is government stability and government programs to help the poorest proportions of the population. And as you know, in Honduras and Guatemala and in El Salvador, governments aren't really oriented towards serving the poorest parts of the population. Here, the government has, if anything, driven even higher its efforts to help the poorest in Nicaragua. And The level of extreme poverty has been cut dramatically. The government has been building hospitals. In the last 14 years, I think they've now either built or started to build about 21 new hospitals in a country of only 6 million people. And so that's a very important factor, I think, the pro-poor policies of the government. And another very important factor, especially in comparison with Honduras, is that Nicaragua is extraordinarily safe. There isn't the same violence either at street level, the gang violence that takes place in Honduras, nor is there the victimization of human rights defenders or people protesting about environmental damage, as is happening in Honduras. And I think people generally here feel very safe. Obviously, that was not the case during 2018 when we had the attempted coup here, when there was terrible violence. But since then, things have calmed down remarkably, and the country has almost gone back to how it was before, being one of the safest countries in Latin America.
Now, and of course, we have to mention, for those in our audience who aren't aware, that the government you're mentioning is the Sandinista government, led by President Daniel Ortega, a very important figure in world history, in Nicaraguan history, since certainly the late 70s. Which brings me to you, John. A lot of people might be thrown by your accent, but you've been living in Nicaragua for a long time. Can you tell us how long you've been there and how you came to live there, John?
I've been here for 18 years. My wife is Nicaraguan. We married 25 years ago, and she came to live in England for a period before we came back here. And my connection, like a lot of people in the States, with Nicaragua was during the 1980s, after the revolution in 1979, and starting to work in solidarity with the then Sandinista government. And really, after 16 years of neoliberal government from 1990 to 2006, we've seen the continuance of the revolution under the Daniel Ortega governments that have been in place since 2007. And really, apart from that period in 2018, when there was the violent coup attempt here, which sadly led to a lot of deaths and a lot of hardship for people. Apart from that, I think, the revolution has continued to advance, and the country has really changed quite dramatically in the last 15 years or so.
I myself was one of those Americans who went to Nicaragua in the 80s. I was there in 1987. I drove to Nicaragua with the Veterans Peace Convoy in 1988, met Daniel Ortega. Then I was a young man in my early 20s, and it made a huge impact on me, as it did a lot of people who went there. I mean, it really changed me forever. I really converted pretty hard to the left due to my experience there, became a real dedicated anti-imperialist, peace activist, which a lot of people did, like you, like me. At the same time, a lot of people who went there in the 80s, a lot seem to have forgotten the lessons they've learned. And to me, Nicaragua is kind of the redheaded stepson in terms of revolutionary countries. It seems to me that those in the West who are leftists don't have the same, by and large, don't have the same affection for Nicaragua that they have for Cuba, for example. And you and I are different in that way. We have a lot of affection for Nicaragua. But why do you think that is? Why do you think a lot in the Western left have, I guess for lack of a better word, turned their back on Nicaragua?
It's a good question, Dan. And I think somebody summarized the position like this, that many of the people who, like you and me, who came here in the 80s, kind of saw the Sandinista revolution as their revolution. And if now it's taken a slightly different course from then, if people who were revolutionaries here have abandoned the revolution and moved over to the other side, then to people in the States and many people in Europe as well, it's no longer their revolution. But I think the important thing is that it's still the Nicaraguans' revolution. And, people's concern, as I know you know from your visits here on the streets or in the countryside or in the poorer parts of the cities, is what is the government doing for them? And if the government is paving the roads, if the government is extending the electricity supply so that it covers almost 100% of houses even in remote areas, if the government is protecting the environment and switching to renewable energy, if it's building homes, building hospitals, and bringing health services to rural areas. This is what matters to people. And you might debate whether the government has increased its control over the political system. But I honestly don't think that many people here are bothered about the precise details of how the elections work and the government works. What they want to see is results, and they want to see services that benefit poor people. And that's frankly what they have seen over the last 14 years. And thankfully now the Sandinista government is able to do the things that it couldn't do in the 1980s because of those very severe sanctions and the Contra war, which consumed so many lives and disrupted large parts of the country for many years.
Yes, and I saw that when I was there in the 80s. The poverty was pretty palpable. I mean, you saw kids running around without shoes, wearing literally rags. A lot of places didn't have water or sewage, had intermittent electricity. And then the last time I was there, it was a different place, where places that used to be dirt roads are now paved. I mean, the roads are beautiful. The highways are incredible. You don't see that extreme poverty that you saw. One of the first days I was in Nicaragua in 1987, we went out to lunch. I think it was with Father Miguel Descoto, if I'm not mistaken. And we were in a restaurant, and there was just all these kids banging on the windows, begging, and you just don't see that. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not to say there aren't beggars, but you don't see that sort of thing anymore. No. And the Sandinistas have been crucial in alleviating that type of poverty. You mentioned something which is again kind of ironic to me, that you say, well, some people criticize the Sandinistas for exercising too much control in government. But again, there seems to be much more forgiveness for the Cuban Revolution, which makes no bones, no pretense about having a one-party state, mm-hmm. right? And I have no problem with that. By the way, I'm an old school Marxist, so I don't. But it's interesting that people will forgive that, but not forgive the Sandinistas, on the other hand, for the level of control they may exercise, which, at least in my view, comes out of necessity because of the U.S. interference in that country. It's very difficult to operate, I'm sure, as openly and democratically as the Sandinista would like in a poor country that is constantly under U.S. threat and interference. Thank you for tuning in to Voice of the Voiceless. We appreciate you. We hope you appreciate us. If you do appreciate us, please consider joining us on Patreon. And if you do, I'll send you a book like this one of my 6 books. I'll sign it for you and send it to you absolutely for free. This book, I think, is particularly relevant to our show on Congo. I deal a lot with the crisis there and how the U.S. helped create it. So please consider supporting this show.
Yes, I think people need to be very clear what the alternatives are in Latin America, and this what we're talking about applies in Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, many other countries apart from Cuba and Nicaragua. The alternative between, or the options between current governments, which may be seen as having too much power, too much control on the one hand, and what could replace them, isn't some sort of soft left, highly participatory democracy or something. Though that option simply doesn't exist. However people might imagine that it's being put forward by somebody or other. The option that exists if you don't have the present governments in Nicaragua or Cuba is very like Honduras or Guatemala. Police states, that massive investments in the army and in the police, very, very militarized police forces, public services run down, an extractivist approach to the whole country, so that the big international companies allowed to come in to do mining projects, hydro projects, strip the forests, and all the rest of it. These are really the extremes that are on offer. As we saw very clearly in Bolivia after the coup against Evo Morales, what was being offered by the right wing wasn't some socialist paradise. It was, very much the kind of picture that I'm just painting. And thankfully, in Bolivia, people realized that, and they've now voted in the mass party again there. But you and I know very well that these are the options in Latin America, and we have to be very clear about that. If the Ortega government had fallen in the attempted coup in 2018, you and I probably wouldn't be having this kind of conversation now. It wouldn't be possible.
No, and you might have left for good. I mean, I think it would have been a very difficult situation. Either you would have had a right-wing government or no government at all. You would have had some sort of chaos, which the U.S. seems to be totally okay with in countries like Libya, where it's intervened in, Iraq, Afghanistan. The U.S. seems to want chaos in countries where it feels it can go in and then take their resources or exploit their labor. And then when the chaos leads to refugee crises, like we're seeing with the Central American refugee crisis, we complain about it and try to wall people out of here. It's a really shameful situation. Now, we have elections coming up in Nicaragua for president, I believe in November. Daniel Ortega will run again for the Sandinistas. What are you seeing in terms of the sentiment of people? Have you seen any polls, or what? How do you think that's going to turn out?
Well, the opinion polls certainly show what I think is the feeling on the streets, that the Sandinista government will be re-elected, in part because of what we're talking about, what it's done for people, and the stability that it offers compared with the severe instability that appeared to be on offer in 2018, and also because the opposition is so disorganized, and it seemed to be in a constant fight as to who their main presidential candidate or candidates might be. With a broken opposition and a government which in many ways is seen as successful, not just in its pro-poverty, pro-poor programs, but also in the way that it's tackled COVID, and the way it's invested in public services, and probably, during the course of this year, we'll get hold of the vaccines that are needed to vaccinate the majority of the population. It's very difficult to see any other course of action than that the Sandinistas win a healthy majority in November, although presumably that won't stop the US government claiming that the election is a fraud.
One question I have for you, there's a lot of talk in terms of Nicaragua about the Sandinistas and how they relate to women in society. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about that, what your perception is of Nicaragua and the gender issue.
This is an important area, because this is an area in which there is some criticism. For example, there's criticism about the strict abortion law or anti-abortion law, which was actually put in place just before the Sandinistas returned to power in 2007, although it's been left on the statute book since 2006. But unlike what is happening, for example, in El Salvador, where very poor, often very young women are being prosecuted and persecuted for miscarriages and trying to get abortions when after they've been raped, things like that. Here, there have been no attacks either on women for having abortions or on medical personnel for dealing with problem pregnancies. The law is there, but it's largely not implemented. I mean, that's perhaps not an entirely satisfactory situation, but one does have to remember that in Latin America, these anti-abortion laws carry a lot of popular support. More generally, Nicaragua has made tremendous leaps forward, really, I think, in empowering women. 50% of government, senior government posts are held by women. The National Assembly is more than 50% women. Even the police force has more than a third of its officers are women. And in response to a continuing problem of domestic violence, although not as severe as a problem as happens in Honduras or Guatemala or El Salvador or even Costa Rica, the government has been opening women's units in police stations. There are now 58 of these, several of them new. So women can go without fear to report domestic violence or sexual abuse of children, to these women's units in police stations where people are trained to deal with these issues. So I think in many respects, women have made big advances in Nicaragua. Of course, there's much more to be done, but I do think that the last decade or so has shown very promising signs.
In fact, I think it was in 2018 that the UN ranked Nicaragua as 5th in the world for gender equality, number 5, after four northern European countries, right? And the U.S. was far below Nicaragua in terms of that.
Yes, Nicaragua is ranked 5th in the world. I think largely because of the importance it gives to women's role in politics. But there are a number of other factors that were measured in that index as well. And it certainly compares very favorably with other developing countries. And as you say, it compares favorably even with so-called developed countries like the US and the UK.
In Guatemala, for example, I just wrote about this. You see state actors engaged in serious sexual abuse of not only adults, but of children. And this has increased in recent years. In Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, you've seen, terrible repression by the state. And you just don't see that in Nicaragua under the Sandinistas.
No, I mean, there's a continuing problem of domestic violence and sexual abuse of children. I don't think anybody could deny that. And in fact, I know of a case personally quite recently. But it's important that the system exists to try to solve those cases and to ensure that the perpetrators are brought to justice quickly. And that's what exists here. That doesn't exist in Honduras and probably not in Guatemala either. I mean, in Honduras, women are scared to go to the police In fact, there was a notorious incident only 3 or 4 weeks ago where a student nurse was arrested because she was defying she'd broken the curfew that's been imposed because of the pandemic. She was taken to the police station and murdered. Well, there aren't incidents of that kind in Nicaragua, and women can go to the police and report violence or report abuse with the security that their cases will be dealt with, and the perpetrators will be arrested. I think this is very important.
What would you say to people in the U.S., UK, Canada, other Western countries who are interested in supporting Nicaragua? What would you say to them?
Well, please do. The national organisations like the Alliance for Global Justice in the States, or the Nicaraguan Solidarity Campaign in the UK and Ireland, are very active in supporting Nicaragua, both in political terms and via project work with poor communities. Both the US and the UK and several European countries still have twinning links with Nicaragua. My old city of Leicester in the UK is still linked with the city of Masaya, where I live now in Nicaragua. And there are many of these twinning links still that mean that people can work directly on projects to help poor communities here. And there's been some very successful work by US and European twinning organizations that continues. So there are plenty of routes to continue to support Nicaragua. I think one of the most important things is to get a really good appreciation of the political situation here. Don't be misled by a lot of people who sadly have bought this line that 2018 was about restoring democracy in Nicaragua. It wasn't anything of the kind. 2018, may have been people involved in the uprising then who thought they were restoring democracy, but that certainly wouldn't have been the outcome if they'd won in that attempted coup. And really, Nicaragua is trying to restore the path it was following, or has restored the path that it was following, of programs to help the poorest communities. We saw a recent example with the 2 hurricanes that hit the Caribbean coast, where there was an immediate response from the government. Lives were saved. Hardly anybody died in those 2 very severe hurricanes just at the end of last year. Whereas in contrast, in Honduras, people are still living in temporary shelters, even 3 months after the hurricanes hit our 2 countries. So, please do try to understand the real situation in Nicaragua and support those who continue to support the Sandinista government.
And John, where can people go to find out what's happening in Nicaragua?
Well, I think there's plenty of good information on the websites of the Alliance for Global Justice and the Nicaragua Solidarity Campaign. There have been good articles about Nicaragua in the website of COA, the Council on Hemispheric Affairs. Grey Zone runs good articles on Nicaragua. Counterpunch also. There are plenty of places, or Popular Resistance is another one. There are plenty of websites which are producing good material on Nicaragua, on detailed aspects of what's going on the response to COVID, for example. So there are plenty of ways in which to find out what's really happening here. And I encourage people to read widely and get a range of viewpoints on what's going on, because sadly there are too many people on the left, on the progressive left, who have decided that the Ortega government should be attacked, not supported.
Yes. Well, John, you've been wonderful. I applaud you. I applaud your work. You've been a beacon of truth on Nicaragua over the years, especially during the 2018 crisis. And I appreciate you coming on the show today.
You're very welcome. I'm delighted to talk to you again, Dan. I hope to see you in Nicaragua very soon.
You will, I promise. Thank you, John. You've been listening to Voice of the Voiceless. I'm Dan Kovalik, and that was John Perry joining us live from Masaya, Nicaragua. If you like Voice of the Voiceless, I hope you keep tuning in. You can find us on Spotify, Twitter, and Facebook. And if you find this program of value to you, please consider joining us on Patreon. Thank you.